The hospital monitors screamed in sterile harmony. 12 specialists, $200,000 in consultations. And Harrison Caldwell's 7-year-old son was still dying. Then a waitress in a ketchup-stained apron pushed past security. "I know what's wrong," Ramona Cruz said, her calloused hands steady against the glass separating her from the boy she'd never met. The doctors turned. One laughed. Another reached for his phone. Security, lawsuit, liability. But Harrison saw something in her eyes that 48 hours of elite medicine hadn't given him. Certainty. She'd been here before. She'd survived what his son had, and she'd buried someone who didn't. "You have 90 seconds to tell me why I should listen to you," Harrison said, his voice breaking on the last word. Ramona's fingers found the medical alert bracelet hidden beneath her sleeve. "Because your wife was my family. And this," she pointed at Wyatt's monitors, "runs in our blood." 3 days earlier, Harrison Caldwell had believed money could solve anything. His corner office on the 42nd floor overlooked Seattle like a kingdom he'd built from code and quantum algorithms. Caldwell Quantum Technologies had made him a billionaire by 35, and at 42, he still worked 16-hour days because work was predictable. Work had rules. Work didn't break your heart and leave you holding a newborn while nurses covered your wife's face with a sheet. Wyatt was everything Vanessa had left him. Harrison saw her in the boy's hazel eyes, in the way he tilted his head when he was thinking, in his fascination with stars and rockets and all the mysteries beyond Earth's atmosphere. But Harrison couldn't look at those eyes for too long, couldn't sit too close, couldn't read him bedtime stories in that quiet voice parents used because quiet felt like intimacy, and intimacy felt like standing at the edge of a cliff waiting to fall. So Harrison protected instead. He hired the best nanny money could buy, Iris Mendoza, patient and warm in all the ways Harrison had forgotten how to be. He scheduled Wyatt's pediatric checkups every 2 weeks instead of every 6 months. He personally reviewed the boy's meal plans, his school curriculum, his daily schedule. He installed air purifiers in every room and hired a nutritionist to optimize Wyatt's health down to the micronutrient. But he didn't play catch in the backyard, didn't build Lego rockets on rainy afternoons, didn't tuck Wyatt in at night, even though the boy always left his door open, always left the hallway light on, always waited. "Dad, can you watch me on the swings today?" Wyatt had asked that Tuesday morning, his small fingers wrapped around a glass of orange juice Harrison had checked 3 times for proper vitamin C content. Harrison glanced up from his tablet, already scrolling through the morning's stock reports. "I'll watch the video Iris takes." Wyatt's face did something complicated, a flash of disappointment so quick Harrison almost missed it, replaced immediately by the careful smile of a child who'd learned not to ask for too much. "Okay, that's okay." And it was okay, Harrison told himself. It had to be okay, because the alternative was letting himself love his son the way he'd loved Vanessa. And Harrison Caldwell didn't survive loss like that twice. Better to keep Wyatt safe from a distance. Better to be the fortress than the open door. The call came at 2:17 that afternoon. Harrison was in a board meeting, negotiating a merger that would add another $100 million to the company's valuation, when his phone lit up with Iris's name. He ignored it. She called again. And again. "Excuse me," Harrison said, standing so abruptly his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. He answered on the 4th ring. "This better be—" "Mr. Caldwell, it's Wyatt." Iris's voice cracked in the middle of his name. "He collapsed during recess. The school called an ambulance. We're going to Cascade Medical." The merger didn't matter anymore. The board members staring at him didn't matter. Harrison was already moving toward the elevator, his assistant Roland Hayes scrambling to keep up, asking questions. Harrison couldn't hear over the roaring in his head that sounded like monitor alarms, like nurses saying, "I'm sorry, like 7 years of carefully constructed walls crashing down all at once. He made it to the hospital in 12 minutes. Wyatt was conscious but pale, his small body dwarfed by the emergency room bed, an IV already trailing from his arm like a lifeline to machines that beeped too fast. Harrison stood in the doorway, couldn't make his feet move forward, couldn't make his lungs pull in enough air. "Dad?" Wyatt's voice was so small. "My stomach really hurts." And Harrison walked in, sat on the edge of the bed, put his hand on Wyatt's forehead the way Vanessa used to, checking for fever with a mother's instinct Harrison had never developed. "The doctors are going to figure it out, buddy. You're going to be fine." He'd said the same thing to Vanessa once. She hadn't been fine. The first doctor was young, confident, efficient, ran a panel of tests and came back with a smile that meant nothing serious. Probably just a stomach bug. Kids get dehydrated easily. We'll keep him overnight for observation. Harrison wanted to believe her. Spent 6 hours watching Wyatt sleep fitfully, his small face scrunched in discomfort, while nurses checked vitals and adjusted IV drips and said everything looked stable. But Wyatt didn't get better. By morning, he was worse. Vomiting, feverish, his skin taking on a greyish tint that made Harrison's stomach drop like he was falling and wouldn't stop. The young doctor ordered more tests, brought in a gastroenterologist, then a hematologist, then an endocrinologist. Each specialist examined Wyatt, ordered different tests, suggested different diagnoses, contradicted the one before. Harrison made phone calls, pulled strings. By day 2, he'd assembled what one nurse quietly called the most expensive medical conference she'd ever seen. Specialists from Boston Children's Hospital joined via video call. A renowned diagnostician from Johns Hopkins flew in personally. A researcher from Switzerland who'd published groundbreaking work on pediatric metabolic disorders arrived at midnight and went straight to Wyatt's room. They ran tests Harrison didn't know existed, scanned organs with machines that cost more than most people's houses, analyzed blood samples with equipment so precise it could count individual cells, and they found nothing. Nothing that explained why a healthy 7-year-old boy was deteriorating so rapidly his kidneys were starting to fail. It could be a rare autoimmune response, one doctor suggested. We could try immunosuppressants. Or it could be an unidentified toxin. Another interrupted. We should start chelation therapy immediately. You're both wrong, the Swiss researcher said flatly. The enzyme markers suggest a genetic component. We need to sequence his entire genome, look for mutations. Harrison sat in the hallway outside the conference room, where 12 of the world's most brilliant medical minds were arguing about his son's life like it was an intellectual puzzle, a case study, something interesting instead of everything. His designer suit was wrinkled. He couldn't remember when he'd last eaten. His watch said it was Wednesday evening, which meant Wyatt had been sick for 36 hours, which meant Harrison had spent 36 hours watching his son fade and doing nothing useful because money couldn't buy the one thing he needed: an answer. His phone buzzed. Roland, asking if he should postpone tomorrow's shareholder meeting. Harrison didn't respond. Another buzz. His lawyer, saying something about the merger. Harrison turned the phone off. A nurse walked by carrying a tray of coffee cups from the hospital cafeteria. Not the good coffee from the executive lounge, the cheap stuff from the basement vending machines that tasted like burnt plastic. Harrison remembered suddenly that there was a coffee shop in his building, a small place on the ground floor that he'd never actually visited, just walked past every morning when Roland brought his espresso up to the office. What was it called? The Daily Grind. Something generic like that. The details were absurd, irrelevant, but Harrison's brain latched onto them anyway because thinking about coffee shops was easier than thinking about the fact that his son was dying, and Harrison had spent 7 years keeping him at arm's length, and now he was running out of time to To what? To be the father he should have been from the start? To tell Wyatt he loved him in a voice that didn't sound like a business transaction? To hold him close instead of watching from doorways like a ghost haunting his own life? Mr. Caldwell? Dr. Patricia Holbrook stood in front of him, and Harrison hadn't even noticed her approach. She was the attending physician, the one coordinating all these specialists, the one whose face had grown progressively more strained as each expert failed to solve the mystery. We'd like to discuss palliative care options. The words didn't make sense. Harrison stared at her, waiting for the translation, for the explanation that would make those words mean something other than what they obviously meant. "We're not giving up," Dr. Holbrook added quickly, her professional mask slipping just enough to show the human underneath, the doctor who probably had kids of her own and knew exactly what she was telling a father. "But Wyatt's kidneys are failing, and we need to be realistic about—" "No." Harrison stood. He was taller than Dr. Holbrook, broader, and he used every inch of that physical presence now like a weapon. "You don't get to be realistic. You figure this out. I don't care what it costs. I don't care if you have to fly in every specialist on the planet. You fix him." "Mr. Caldwell, I understand your frustration." "Do you?" Harrison's voice cracked. "Do you understand what it's like to lose everyone you love? Because I've done it once. I stood in a room like this and watched my wife die, and I held my son for the first time while they were still cleaning her blood off the floor. So no, doctor, you don't understand anything about this, and you don't get to tell me to give up." Dr. Holbrook's eyes were wet. She nodded once, sharp and professional, her own grief or exhaustion or whatever she was feeling locked down tight. "We'll keep trying." Harrison walked past her, down the corridor toward Wyatt's room. He was going to sit with his son. He was going to hold his hand. He was going to tell him something, anything. All the things he should have been saying for 7 years. But he stopped outside the door. Through the window he could see Wyatt sleeping, his small chest rising and falling too rapidly, his face pale against the white pillow, machines and tubes turning him into something fragile and breakable and temporary. And Harrison couldn't move, couldn't cross that threshold. Because walking into that room meant admitting this was really happening, meant facing the possibility that money and power and control meant nothing when biology failed, meant loving someone so completely that losing them would destroy whatever was left of Harrison Caldwell. So he stood there, watching from the doorway, keeping his distance even now, even when time was running out, because Harrison Caldwell was very good at building walls and very bad at tearing them down. That's when he heard the commotion. Raised voices from the direction of the ICU, security radios crackling. Someone saying, "Ma'am, you can't be here," in that firm voice that meant a situation was escalating. Harrison turned, more out of instinct than interest, and saw a woman. Small, maybe 5'3" in her worn sneakers. Dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Wearing black pants and a button-up shirt with "The Daily Grind" embroidered on the pocket, the fabric stained with what looked like ketchup and coffee and the evidence of a long shift. 2 security guards were trying to politely but firmly escort her back toward the elevators, and she was resisting with the kind of calm stubbornness that said she'd dealt with people trying to move her before and knew exactly how to make herself immovable. "I need to see Dr. Holbrook," the woman was saying, her voice level, accented slightly, second generation something. Harrison's ear for international business partnerships told him, though he couldn't place which country. "It's about the Caldwell boy." Harrison's entire body went cold and hot simultaneously. "Who are you?" The woman's eyes found his across the corridor, brown eyes, dark and certain, and looking at him like she could see through every expensive layer of his tailored defenses straight down to the terrified father underneath. My name is Ramona Cruz. I work at the coffee shop in your building, and I think I know what's wrong with your son." The security guards looked at Harrison, waiting for instructions. Dr. Holbrook had emerged from the conference room, along with half the specialists, all of them staring at this waitress who'd somehow gotten past hospital security and was now claiming medical knowledge she couldn't possibly have. One of the doctors, the gastroenterologist from Boston, actually laughed. Not cruelly, but with the kind of exhausted disbelief that came from 2 days of failed diagnoses and mounting pressure. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but—" "Hereditary fructose intolerance," Ramona said, her eyes still locked on Harrison. "That's what he has. The doctors missed it because they tested for the common mutation. There are 14 rare variants. Your son has one of them." The corridor went silent. Dr. Holbrook stepped forward. "How could you possibly—" "Because I have it too." Ramona pulled up her left sleeve, revealing a medical alert bracelet that looked old, worn, the kind you got as a child and never took off. "I almost died when I was 8. Took 6 hospitals before a school nurse figured it out because she'd seen it once before in a student from her previous school. The symptoms match exactly. Abdominal pain, vomiting, kidney failure progression. And if I'm right, you've been making it worse." "That's absurd," the Swiss researcher said, but his voice lacked conviction. "What would make it worse?" "The IV fluids." Ramona turned to him. "I saw the bag when they wheeled him past. Dextrose solution, right? You're pumping fructose directly into his bloodstream. And before that—" She looked at Harrison now, and her expression was gentle but uncompromising. "I'm betting someone had him on health supplements. Protein powders, maybe. Vitamin formulas. Anything with maltodextrin or corn syrup solids." Harrison's mouth had gone dry. The nutritionist. The expensive, highly recommended nutritionist he'd hired 3 months ago. The special supplement powder she'd insisted would optimize Wyatt's growth and immune function. The powder Harrison had personally mixed into Wyatt's morning smoothie every single day because he was protecting his son, because he was being a good father, because money could buy the best health advice available. "Oh God," Harrison heard himself say. "I've been poisoning him." "You didn't know," Ramona said, and somehow her voice made it across the space between them, made it through the static of Harrison's disintegrating world. "No one knew. That's the problem. The condition is so rare that most doctors never see it. And people with money—" She hesitated, choosing words carefully. "They trust expensive experts. They don't think to question." Dr. Holbrook was already moving, pulling out her phone, calling down to the lab. "Run a complete aldolase B enzyme panel. Check for all known HFI mutations, not just the common ones. And someone get that IV out of him now. Switch to saline only, nothing with any sugar compounds. Move." The specialists scattered. The Swiss researcher was already on his laptop, pulling up journal articles. The Boston gastroenterologist was calling his hospital's genetics lab. Within seconds, the corridor had transformed from a space of feet into something else. Purpose, direction, the electric energy of doctors who suddenly had a lead after days of dead ends. Harrison couldn't move, couldn't process. His son was dying because Harrison had tried too hard to keep him healthy. Had paid experts to optimize and enhance and improve, and all of it had been slowly killing Wyatt, because sometimes the expensive answer was the wrong answer, because sometimes knowledge came from lived experience instead of prestigious degrees, because Harrison Caldwell had spent 7 years believing control and money could protect his son from everything, when really he'd just built a different kind of danger. "Who are you?" Harrison asked again, because it was the only question his brain could form. How did you know?" Ramona looked toward Wyatt's room. Harrison followed her gaze and saw what she was looking at. Through the window, the medical alert bracelet on Wyatt's wrist. Harrison had put it there when Wyatt was born, engraved with Vanessa Cruz Caldwell, keeping her maiden name present, keeping her memory attached to their son, keeping Cruz. Harrison said slowly. Vanessa was my second cousin, Ramona said, and her voice held layers of grief Harrison recognized because he carried the same weight. We weren't close, different parts of the family, different social circles, but when she died, I went to the funeral. I saw you holding Wyatt, and I saw the bracelet, and I thought... She stopped, her hand touching her own bracelet. I thought about telling you then, about the genetic component. But you had just lost your wife, and you were looking at your baby like he was the only thing keeping you alive. And I didn't want to be the person who added more fear to that moment. So you've been watching, Harrison said. And it wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact that was sliding into place like a puzzle piece he hadn't known was missing. All this time, at the coffee shop. I took the job there 2 years ago specifically to be close. Ramona met his eyes steadily, not apologizing, not defending, just explaining. I've been studying this condition since my sister died of it. Lucia. She was 5. I was 14, and I tried to tell the doctors what was wrong because I'd survived it, and I knew the signs. But I was just a kid. They didn't listen. She died 3 days later. The words hung in the sterile hospital air like smoke. Harrison understood suddenly why this woman, this stranger, this waitress, had pushed past security and risked arrest and public humiliation to interrupt a medical conference she had no credentials to join. She was doing what she'd been unable to do at 14. She was being the voice that saved a child because she'd failed to save her sister. And that failure had carved out something permanent inside her. If you're wrong, Dr. Holbrook started. Then I'm wrong, Ramona said simply. But if I'm right, you have maybe 6 hours before his kidneys fail completely. The treatment is simple. Stop all fructose, sucrose, and sorbitol intake immediately. Supportive care for the acute toxicity. He should stabilize within 24 hours if this is it. And if it's not? The Swiss researcher asked. Ramona's jaw tightened. Then you go back to your other theories, and I go back to my coffee shop, and everyone can agree that the waitress was crazy for thinking she knew better than 12 specialists. Harrison found himself walking toward her. The security guards tensed, but he waved them off. He stopped 3 feet from Ramona Cruz, close enough to see the coffee stains on her shirt, the exhaustion around her eyes, the medical alert bracelet she'd worn for 23 years as a reminder of what could go wrong when medicine failed and luck ran out. How long? Harrison asked. How long have you been watching my son? 2 years, Ramona said, not flinching from the question. I recognized symptoms about 3 months ago. The way he'd come in after school, sometimes looking pale, the nausea, but they were mild, manageable, and I thought maybe he'd gotten lucky. Maybe he had a less severe variant. Maybe he'd be okay without intervention. Her voice dropped. Then I saw the ambulance yesterday. I called the hospital pretending to be family, found out he was deteriorating, and I knew what was happening because I've watched it happen before. It should have felt invasive, creepy, even. This stranger monitoring his son from a distance, studying him, making medical assumptions without permission or authority. But all Harrison felt was a strange sense of relief, like the loneliness he'd been carrying for 7 years had just gotten fractionally lighter because someone else had been watching too. Someone else had cared enough to pay attention. Someone else had loved Wyatt from a distance, not despite the risk of loss, but because the risk of loss made caring matter more. Mr. Caldwell, Dr. Holbrook said, her phone pressed to her chest, her expression careful. The lab can have preliminary results in 40 minutes if we mark it urgent, but starting treatment based on an unconfirmed diagnosis from a non-medical professional it's not protocol. If something goes wrong, then something goes wrong, Harrison said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. But right now, your protocols are failing, and she's offering a solution. So we test. And while we wait for confirmation, we stop making it worse. He looked at Ramona. What else? Besides removing fructose sources, what else do we need to do? Ramona's eyes widened slightly, like she hadn't expected him to believe her, hadn't expected any of them to believe her. Supportive care, fluids, pure saline only, monitor kidney function closely, check for liver damage. And she hesitated. If it is HFI, you'll need to completely restructure his diet. No fruit, no table sugar, no processed foods with hidden sweeteners. It's manageable, but it's lifelong. He'll need that bracelet to mean something. Harrison thought about all the ways he'd tried to protect Wyatt. The nutritionist, the supplements, the carefully optimized meal plans designed by someone with a doctorate and a $5,000 consultation fee. All of it wrong. All of it dangerous. While the answer stood in his building's lobby every morning, serving coffee, wearing the truth on her wrist, watching his son with the vigilance of someone who knew exactly what was at stake because she'd already lost the same battle once. Do it, Harrison said to Dr. Holbrook. All of it. Test, treat, and if she's right. He looked at Ramona again. Then you're not going back to that coffee shop. You're going to help us make sure this never happens to another family. The lab results came back in 37 minutes. Positive for hereditary fructose intolerance. Rare variant, exactly as Ramona had diagnosed from a glimpse through a window, and 23 years of living with the same genetic mutation. The treatment was immediate. Pure IV saline, careful monitoring, elimination of all fructose sources. Within 6 hours, Wyatt's vitals began to stabilize. Within 12 hours, the grayish tint left his skin. Within 24 hours, he opened his eyes and asked for his dad, and this time Harrison didn't hesitate in the doorway. He walked into that room, sat on the bed, pulled his son into his arms, and held him the way he should have been holding him all along, close enough to feel the heartbeat, tight enough to communicate safety, long enough to make up for 7 years of distance. "You're squishing me," Wyatt mumbled into Harrison's shoulder, but his small arms wrapped around his father's neck, and he didn't let go. "Good," Harrison said, and his voice broke on the word, but he didn't care. "I'm going to squish you every day from now on." "Promise?" "Promise." Wyatt pulled back just enough to look at Harrison's face, and his expression was curious in that way children got when they were trying to figure out if adults were telling the truth. "Dad, you're crying." "Yeah, buddy. Yeah, I am. But I'm okay now, right? The doctors fixed me?" Harrison glanced toward the door, where Ramona stood talking quietly with Dr. Holbrook, explaining the dietary restrictions Wyatt would need to follow, the warning signs to watch for, the way she'd learned to live a full life with a condition most people had never heard of. She'd changed out of her stained work shirt into scrubs someone had found for her, and she looked almost like she belonged in this space, confident, knowledgeable, necessary. "The doctors helped," Harrison said carefully. "But the person who really fixed you, her name is Ramona. She's family, and she's going to teach us how to keep you healthy." "Like a superhero?" Wyatt's eyes lit up the way they did when he talked about rockets and space explorers. "Exactly like a superhero," Harrison said. "One who wears a medical bracelet and knows everything about a condition so rare that even 12 specialists didn't recognize it." "Cool," Wyatt said decisively. "Can I meet her?" Harrison waved Ramona over. She approached slowly, cautiously, like she wasn't sure she belonged in this moment. Wasn't sure she was welcome in the private space between father and son. But Wyatt smiled at her, the open, uncomplicated smile of a child who didn't know about class differences or professional credentials or any of the artificial barriers adults constructed between people. "Hi," Wyatt said. "My dad says you're a superhero." Ramona's face did something complicated, surprise and grief, and something that might have been joy all tangled together. "I don't know about that. I just knew what to look for because I have the same thing you have. See?" She held out her wrist, showing him the bracelet. Wyatt's eyes went wide. "You're like me." "Exactly like you," Ramona said gently. "Which means I can teach you all the tricks. How to read food labels, what to do if you accidentally eat something wrong, how to explain it to friends without making it a big deal." She paused. "And how to be a kid first and a medical condition second." "Did anyone teach you?" Wyatt asked, tilting his head in that way he did, in that way Vanessa used to. Ramona's expression shuttered briefly, and Harrison saw the shadow of a 5-year-old girl who hadn't survived long enough to learn those tricks. "No," Ramona said quietly. "I figured it out alone. But you won't have to. You have your dad, and you have me, and we're going to make sure you get to do everything other kids do, just with a few modifications." Wyatt seemed to consider this. Then he unclasped his own medical alert bracelet, the one Harrison had put on him as an infant, the one engraved with his mother's name, and held it out to Ramona. "Can you wear this one? So we match?" Harrison's throat closed up. Ramona's eyes went bright with tears she didn't let fall. She took the bracelet carefully, like it was made of something more precious than metal, and fastened it around her wrist next to her own. "How about we both wear both?" Ramona said, taking off her childhood bracelet and fastening it around Wyatt's wrist next to his hospital band. "That way we're always connected. Deal?" "Deal," Wyatt said, grinning. Then he looked at Harrison. "Dad, is she going to come home with us?" Harrison hadn't thought that far ahead. Hadn't thought past the immediate crisis, past the moment of Wyatt opening his eyes, past the overwhelming relief of having his son alive and awake and asking questions. But now he looked at Ramona Cruz, second cousin to the wife he'd lost, guardian angel to the son he'd almost lost, keeper of knowledge that had saved Wyatt's life when medicine failed, and realized the answer was obvious. "If she wants to," Harrison said. "We have a lot to learn, and I think—" He met Ramona's eyes. "I think we have a lot to talk about. About Vanessa. About family. About making sure other families don't go through this." Ramona nodded slowly. "I've been taking online medical courses for 6 years. Pre-med curriculum. I was going to apply to medical school next year, but—" She gestured vaguely, and Harrison understood what she wasn't saying. Money. Time. The reality that working full-time at a coffee shop while studying left no room for the application fees, the MCAT prep, the sheer financial burden of pursuing a medical degree without family wealth to cushion the journey. "You're going to medical school," Harrison said, and it wasn't a question. "Full scholarship, full support, and when you graduate, you're going to lead research on hereditary fructose intolerance at a center we're going to build. In Lucia's name." Ramona stared at him. "You can't just—" "I absolutely can," Harrison said. "I've spent 7 years throwing money at problems and getting worse outcomes, but this—" He gestured between Ramona and Wyatt. "This is worth every dollar. Your knowledge saved my son. Your experience is valuable, and your sister's death shouldn't be meaningless. Dad's really rich," Wyatt added helpfully. "He can totally pay for stuff." Despite everything, the exhaustion, the fear, the weight of the last 48 hours, Harrison laughed. Actually laughed. For the first time in so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like. Ramona laughed too, And then Wyatt was giggling, and the hospital room that had felt like a tomb 2 hours ago suddenly felt like the beginning of something else. Something that looked like healing, like family, like the kind of second chance Harrison hadn't thought he deserved. The next 3 days were a blur of dietary consultations, genetic counseling, and careful monitoring to ensure Wyatt's kidneys recovered fully from the acute poisoning. Harrison never left the hospital. Ramona came every morning before her shift and every evening after, teaching Wyatt which foods were safe, which were dangerous, how to advocate for himself. She was patient and thorough and completely unsentimental about the restrictions, treating them like interesting puzzles rather than burdens. "Can I still have birthday cake?" Wyatt asked on the 3rd day. "Special birthday cake," Ramona said. "I'll teach you how to make it. No sugar, but it still tastes good. My mom used to make it for me." "Is your mom a superhero too?" Ramona's expression flickered. "She was. She died when I was 16. "Oh." Wyatt processed this with the blunt honesty of children. "So you don't have parents?" "No," Ramona said simply. Wyatt looked at Harrison, then back at Ramona. "Well, now you have us. Right, Dad?" Harrison met Ramona's eyes over his son's head, saw the loneliness there that matched his own, the grief that never quite healed, the survival that came with scars you carried forever. "Right," Harrison said. "Now we have each other." They took Wyatt home on a Friday afternoon. Harrison had arranged for a dietary specialist to review every item in their kitchen, removing anything with hidden fructose sources. Iris had been briefed extensively. The refrigerator was stocked with Ramona-approved foods. The pantry had been completely reconstructed. Harrison had even replaced his office coffee maker with one from the daily grind, and he'd offered Ramona's manager enough money to not only release her from her contract, but to hire 2 new staff members in her place. But the house felt different now. Harrison noticed it immediately. The silence that had always felt normal suddenly felt wrong. He'd spent 7 years making this house into a fortress, a controlled environment where nothing unexpected could happen, where grief couldn't sneak up on him if he just kept everything organized and predictable. Now it felt like a museum instead of a home. "Your house is really big," Wyatt said to Ramona, who'd come home with them to do the first week of dietary transition supervision. "My room is on the 2nd floor. Do you want to see?" "I'd love to," Ramona said, and let Wyatt drag her toward the stairs, chattering about his toy rockets and his telescope and his drawings of imaginary planets. Harrison stood in the foyer, listening to their voices fade up the staircase, and felt the weight of 7 years pressing down on him. He'd built this house to be Vanessa's dream home. They'd moved in 2 months before she died. She'd never slept in the master bedroom, never cooked in the kitchen, never sat in the reading nook she'd designed. And Harrison had kept it all exactly as she'd planned it, a shrine to a future that never happened, a life frozen in potential rather than lived. "Mr. Caldwell?" Iris approached from the kitchen, her expression gentle. She'd been with them for 5 years, watched Harrison keep his distance from Wyatt, never said anything because it wasn't her place. But now her eyes held something that looked like approval. "It's good to hear him so happy. He almost died," Harrison said, and the words came out harsher than he intended. "He almost died because I was trying too hard to keep him healthy, because I trusted experts who didn't know him, because I was so afraid of losing him that I—" He stopped, couldn't finish. "You didn't know," Iris said, echoing Ramona's words from days ago. "But now you do, and you're doing better. That's what matters." Harrison wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that recognizing mistakes meant he could fix them, that showing up meant more than all the years of absence, that love could be retroactive if you just tried hard enough. But he'd spent 42 years learning that some things couldn't be fixed with money or effort, or good intentions. Some things you just had to live with. Ramona came back downstairs an hour later. Wyatt had fallen asleep in his room, the first real sleep he'd had since before the hospital, his body finally trusting that it was safe to rest. Harrison and Ramona sat in the living room that Vanessa had designed, drinking coffee Ramona had made. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "You don't have to do this," Harrison said finally. "The medical school, the research center, any of it. I know I made it sound like an obligation, but it's not an obligation," Ramona interrupted. "It's a chance to make Lucia's death mean something, to save other kids, to be the person I needed when I was 14 and terrified and no one would listen." She paused. "But you don't have to do this either. You don't owe me anything. I didn't save Wyatt for payment." "I know," Harrison said. "But I spent 7 years trying to protect my son from loss by keeping him at a distance. All I did was make him lonely and almost kill him with expensive mistakes. So maybe," he searched for words, "maybe doing something that actually helps people is how I stop making the same mistakes." Ramona studied him over the rim of her coffee mug. "You really loved her, Vanessa." It wasn't a question, but Harrison answered anyway. "She was the only person who ever looked at me and saw something other than potential or profit. I was building the company, working 100 hours a week, convinced I was going to change the world with quantum computing. And she'd listen to me talk about algorithms and then ask if I'd remembered to eat lunch." He smiled, but it hurt. "She made me human. And when she died, I forgot how." "She talked about you sometimes," Ramona said quietly. "At family gatherings. I only met her maybe 4 or 5 times, but I remember her showing everyone pictures of the house you were building together. She was so excited about the reading nook, said she was going to sit there every Sunday morning with coffee and terrible romance novels." Harrison looked toward the reading nook. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a custom window seat with storage underneath, built-in bookshelves that had stayed empty for 7 years because filling them felt like admitting Vanessa would never read in that space. "I haven't sat there once," he admitted. "Couldn't." "Maybe that's the problem," Ramona said. "You've been keeping everything frozen. The house, your relationship with Wyatt, your own life. Like if you don't move forward, you won't have to accept that she's really gone." The words should have felt like an attack. Instead, they felt like relief. Someone finally saying out loud what Harrison had been avoiding for 7 years. "How do you do it?" he asked. "Move forward after losing everyone?" Ramona was quiet for a long time. "I don't think you move forward," she said eventually. "I think you move with. You carry them. Lucia's been dead for 17 years, and I still talk to her sometimes. Still think about what she'd say if she could see me now. Still make her favorite foods on her birthday even though there's no one to share them with." She touched the bracelet on her wrist. Wyatt's bracelet now, Vanessa's name engraved there. "They don't leave. They just change shape, become part of how you see the world." Harrison thought about that. About Vanessa becoming part of how he protected Wyatt instead of how he loved him. About grief that built walls instead of bridges. About the difference between carrying someone with you and letting them crush you under their weight. "I want to put her photos up," Harrison said suddenly. "Around the house. I want Wyatt to know her face, her smile. I want to tell him stories about her instead of just existing in the shadow of her absence." "That's good," Ramona said. "That's really good. And I want you to tell me about Lucia," Harrison continued. "Because if we're going to build a research center in her name, I should know who she was, what she liked, what she would have become if she'd lived." Ramona's eyes went bright again, but this time she let the tears fall. She wanted to be a veterinarian. She was obsessed with dogs, used to draw them constantly, these wild, imaginative dogs with wings and rainbow fur and superpowers. She laughed, wiping her face. The last thing she drew before she got sick was a flying dog rescuing a kid from a burning building. She was 5 years old and already designing heroes. Then the research center needs a logo, Harrison said. A flying dog, something bright and hopeful and completely Lucia. Ramona stared at him. You're serious? Completely serious. Harrison set down his coffee. I've spent 7 years being afraid of everything. Afraid of losing Wyatt, afraid of feeling too much, afraid of being human because humans get hurt. And all it did was make me absent, make me useless when it mattered. So yes, I'm serious. About the research center, about medical school for you, about being the kind of father Wyatt deserves instead of the kind I've been. He met her eyes. And about being the kind of family Vanessa would have wanted us to be. You, me, and Wyatt. Connected by loss, maybe, but also by survival, by choosing to do better. You're going to make me cry in your very expensive living room, Ramona said, but she was smiling through the tears. It's okay, Harrison said. I think this room could use some actual emotion. It's been pretty sterile for 7 years. They sat there as afternoon light filtered through the windows Vanessa had chosen, in the house she'd designed but never lived in, drinking coffee and talking about the people they'd lost and the people they were trying to become. And somewhere upstairs, Wyatt slept peacefully, his body healing, his future secured by a waitress who'd refused to be invisible, and a father who was finally learning to be present. The Lucia Cruz Memorial Research Center broke ground 8 months later. Harrison had purchased a building near Cascade Medical Center, gutted it, and rebuilt it according to specifications designed by the best medical architects in the country. And by Ramona, who knew exactly what patients with rare metabolic disorders needed because she'd spent 23 years being one. The lobby featured a massive mural of Lucia's flying dog, painted by a local artist working from Ramona's childhood drawings. Bright, hopeful, impossible, exactly what medical care should feel like. Ramona had started medical school at the University of Washington that fall. Harrison had endowed a scholarship program in her name for working-class students pursuing rare disease research. She studied during the day, worked part-time at the research center in the evenings, and had dinner with Harrison and Wyatt every Sunday. Sometimes Iris joined them. Sometimes Roland did, bringing his husband and their twin daughters who were Wyatt's age and thought his medical bracelet was the coolest thing they'd ever seen. Harrison had learned to cook. Not well, but adequately. Simple meals that followed Wyatt's dietary restrictions, made with his own hands instead of ordered from private chefs. He'd learned to play catch, to build Lego rockets, to read bedtime stories in that quiet voice that no longer felt dangerous. He'd learned that loving someone completely didn't mean you'd lose them. It meant you'd have them fully while they were here, and carry them wholly if they left. And slowly, carefully, the house became a home. Photos of Vanessa appeared on walls and shelves. Vanessa laughing, Vanessa in her wedding dress, Vanessa holding an infant Wyatt with an expression of exhausted joy. Harrison told stories about her, how she'd snort when she laughed too hard, how she'd been terrible at cooking but insisted on trying anyway, how she'd believed in Harrison's dreams even when they seemed impossible. Wyatt absorbed these stories like water, building a relationship with the mother he'd never known through the memories of people who'd loved her. And he thrived. His health stabilized completely once they'd eliminated all fructose sources and established careful monitoring. He grew, laughed, asked endless questions about stars and space, and whether people with HFI could be astronauts. Ramona assured him they absolutely could, with the right accommodations. On the 1-year anniversary of the day Wyatt had collapsed, Harrison took him to the research center. They stood in the lobby looking at the flying dog mural, and Wyatt asked the question Harrison had been waiting for. "Dad, would I have died if Ramona hadn't come?" Harrison knelt down so they were eye level. "Probably," he said, because Wyatt deserved honesty. The doctors would have figured it out eventually, but maybe not fast enough. "So she really did save my life. She really did." Wyatt processed this with the seriousness of an 8-year-old contemplating mortality. "Then I want to help save other kids too, when I grow up. Can I work here?" Harrison thought about the research center, about Lucia's legacy, about the dozens of families who'd already been helped by the diagnostic protocols Ramona was developing. Thought about Vanessa and the reading nook she'd never used, about grief that built walls versus grief that built bridges, about the choice between being frozen or being alive. "You can work here," Harrison said. "But first you're going to be a kid. You're going to play and learn and dream about impossible things. And I'm going to be right here watching. Not from a distance, but close up. Deal?" "Deal," Wyatt said, and hugged his father with the self-conscious affection of a child who'd never learned to hold back. That Sunday, Ramona came for dinner like always. She'd just finished her first year of medical school, top of her class, already publishing research, already being courted by prestigious residency programs. But she still showed up every week wearing jeans and Wyatt's old daily grind shirt that Harrison had framed and given back to her as a graduation gift, and she still made terrible jokes while helping Wyatt with his homework at the kitchen table. "How's the enzyme study going?" Harrison asked, stirring pasta that was actually edible this time. "Promising?" Ramona said. "We identified 3 more rare variants last month. Sent testing protocols to every children's hospital in the country. If we can catch it early, before kids get sick." She trailed off, but her eyes held the light of someone who'd found her purpose. "Lucia would be proud," Harrison said quietly. "Vanessa would be proud of you too," Ramona replied. "Look at this. You're cooking. Wyatt's thriving. You actually know how to use a stove without setting off smoke alarms." "That was one time," Harrison protested, but he was smiling. Wyatt looked up from his math homework. "Hey, Ramona, can we tell my class about HFI next week? For my presentation on what makes me special?" "Absolutely," Ramona said. "What makes you special is that you're the kid who survived something rare and decided to make it part of your superpower instead of your limitation." "Like you," Wyatt said matter-of-factly. "Like all of us," Ramona corrected, glancing at Harrison. "Everyone survived something. The question is what you do with the survival." They ate dinner together, pasta with special sauce, salad with Ramona-approved dressing, fruit-free dessert that Wyatt had helped make. They talked about school and and whether the Mariners would ever win another championship. They laughed. They argued playfully about whose turn it was to load the dishwasher. They existed together in the comfortable chaos of people who'd chosen to be family. And later, after Ramona had gone home and Wyatt was asleep, Harrison sat in Vanessa's reading nook for the first time in 7 years. He'd finally filled the shelves, medical journals Ramona had recommended, children's books about space that Wyatt loved, terrible romance novels Harrison had ordered specifically because Vanessa would have read them. The window seat cushions were new, soft, inviting. Harrison sat there with his coffee and looked out at the city lights and thought about the difference between existing and living. Thought about the father he'd been, distant, controlled, so afraid of loss that he'd lost years of connection. And the father he was becoming, present, imperfect, willing to be hurt if it meant being whole. His phone buzzed. A text from Ramona. "Made it home. Thanks for dinner. Tell Wyatt good luck on his presentation. And Harrison, you did good. Today and every day. Keep going." Harrison typed back. "We did good, all of us. See you next Sunday. Because that was the truth Ramona had taught him, the lesson that had saved Wyatt's life and Harrison's soul. Some answers didn't come from expensive experts or prestigious institutions or the kind of knowledge you could buy. Sometimes they came from people who'd survived, who'd paid attention, who'd refused to be invisible even when the world insisted they should be. Sometimes the person who saved you was the one you'd walked past every morning without seeing, the one who wore their tragedy on their wrist and their hope in their eyes, the one who believed that survival meant something only if you used it to help someone else survive too. Harrison looked at the photo of Vanessa on the shelf beside him. She was laughing in the picture, head thrown back, joy written across every feature. He'd been afraid of that joy for 7 years. Afraid that feeling it would destroy him, that loving completely would mean losing completely, that being human meant being vulnerable, and being vulnerable meant being shattered. But Ramona had been shattered at 8 years old, and again at 14. And she'd put herself back together into someone who saved lives, who chose to care, who wore her sister's memory like armor and her own survival like a gift she was determined to share. If she could do that, if she could lose everything and still show up, still fight, still believe in the possibility of saving the next kid, then Harrison could learn to do the same. "I'm trying," he whispered to Vanessa's photo. "I'm really trying, and I think you'd like who Wyatt's becoming, who we're all becoming." The house was quiet around him, but it wasn't the sterile silence of a museum anymore. It was the settled quiet of a home where people lived and argued and laughed and cried and tried their best, where a boy slept peacefully wearing 2 medical alert bracelets that connected him to both the mother he'd never met and the woman who'd saved his life, where a father had finally learned that protection meant presence, not distance, where grief had built something instead of destroying everything. And somewhere across the city, in a small apartment near the university, Ramona Cruz studied enzyme pathways and thought about the research center that bore her sister's name, thought about the families they'd already helped, the children who wouldn't have to go through what she and Wyatt had survived, thought about the difference between being invisible and being seen, between surviving alone and surviving together, between carrying loss like a weight and carrying it like a light. She touched the bracelet on her wrist, the one that said, Vanessa Cruz Caldwell, the one that connected her to a cousin she barely knew, but who'd somehow given her a family. And she smiled, because sometimes the impossible happened. Sometimes the waitress saved the millionaire's son. Sometimes loss led to connection instead of isolation. Sometimes survival was just the beginning of the story, not the end. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, you got to turn your worst tragedy into someone else's miracle. You got to make the pain mean something. You got to save the next kid, and the one after that, and build a legacy out of loss that looked exactly like hope. That was the real impossible thing. Not the diagnosis or the dramatic rescue or the research center with its flying dog logo. The impossible thing was choosing to love again after loss, choosing to show up after being invisible, choosing to be human and vulnerable and connected even when being alone felt safer. Harrison Caldwell had learned that lesson from a waitress in a ketchup-stained apron, and he spent the rest of his life teaching it to his son, building a research center that embodied it, and being the kind of father and friend and human that Vanessa would have recognized. Present, imperfect, trying. That was all any of them could do. Try. Show up. Pay attention. Listen to the voices that weren't supposed to matter. Save the people you could save, and honor the ones you couldn't by making sure their loss changed something. In the end, no doctor had saved the millionaire's son, but a waitress had. And in doing so, she'd saved the millionaire too. Saved all of them, really. built a family out of grief and a future out of survival, and proved that sometimes the most valuable knowledge comes not from prestigious degrees, but from the simple act of refusing to look away when someone needs help. That was the impossible thing Ramona Cruz had done, and it changed everything.